All right, ladies and gentlemen, I call to order the council workshop for Tuesday, April 2nd at 7 o'clock. My name is Mike Little, Mayor of the District of North Vancouver, and the pleasure falls to me to welcome you all here to our workshop. Just want to note, we don't normally, I apologize for my casual dress here. I normally am wearing a suit for these kinds of things. I was outside for half the day doing activities, and so I was in jeans and a hoodie and thought that would be perfectly appropriate for our meeting here tonight for some reason. I know I just couldn't get back to Seymour in time and get back to it. What we wanted to spend some time talking about tonight is provincial housing initiatives, the first part of it. So Dan's going to go over some of this for us here, but the provincial government back in the fall brought forward a number of housing supply initiatives, 44, 46, 47, what we refer to them. Those are the different bylaws or laws as they were putting them into place. And in that, there were a number of recommendations for things that have to take place on a fixed date. And so we're going to focus tonight on the stuff that has to be done in that sort of first phase, which is out to June 30th. But there is, I highly recommend that people read the different pieces of legislation and the guides that go with it to help inform you about its general applicability. And tonight we're going to talk about how it specifically affects the District of North Vancouver and what that first step is going to be. I did want to mention that tonight we are fashioned as a council workshop, which generally means that if council has clarifying questions as we go through the process, we'll get a response to them. At the tail end, I do have a speaker signed up to speak at this point, and assuming we finish in a reasonable time, we'll make sure that they can be included in it. But I did want to say that the second to last slide in today's presentation is going to include the public information sessions. And so I haven't seen the provincial government going out and doing engagement on this. We thought it was important for our community to make sure that our own residents understand what the impacts are going to be. And so we've committed to do 4 public information sessions over the next month to make sure that people have an opportunity to get their questions answered. Council workshop's not generally the best place for members of the public to come in and get their questions answered. There will be 4 more dates and times, virtual and in person, for members of the public to ask their questions going forward. So please don't be frustrated by the format. This is just an opportunity for the council members to ask clarifying questions as we take our first steps forward, but there will be 4 additional opportunities in the next month for the public to ask clarifying questions and how this is likely to affect them. But at this time, I would like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Milburn for his slides and introduction on this. So Mr. Milburn.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, members of council, members of the community who've come out tonight. My name is Dan Milburn. I'm the General Manager of Planning, Properties and Permits for the District of North Vancouver. With me tonight, in particular, as part of our Provincial Housing Initiative project team, is Andy Bell, a professional engineer, who's been leading a team. So once we became aware of the provincial legislative changes, we brought together a team involving communications, legal, finance, planning, engineering, and others to try to fully understand the potential implications of this provincial legislation and to provide advice to council. Tonight is part of really a multi-step process to try to respond to that provincial legislation. I have to say it is fluid. There are still changes to legislation anticipated. We've heard new announcements today about additional legislative changes and new funding opportunities from the federal government. So we anticipate this will continue to be a fluid environment and we'll have to adapt as we go. So what we're sharing tonight is the best available information that we have at this time based on our analysis to date. We are not seeking a decision of council tonight in terms of bylaw or policy approval. This is really sharing information that we are, as the mayor mentions, about to take out to the community, to inform the community of the provincial legislation and the potential impacts on the community, to receive input, and then to share that input with council when we do bring forward bylaws and policies for council's consideration before June 30th. So that is our key date we're working towards. just moving forward in the presentation. So the mayor mentioned there's a few phases. So when we last spoke to council in a public workshop, that was on February 12th, and we presented high-level information describing Bill 44, which deals with small-scale multi-unit housing, the impacts of public hearings, official community plans, housing needs reports, and the zoning bylaw. What we're focused on tonight is really that first phase, as the mayor mentioned, things that absolutely critically have to get done and responded to by June 30th, 2024. And just for the benefit of our listening audience at home, as well as in the gallery, we will be using a couple acronyms. One is called TOA, or Transit Oriented Areas. And these are areas defined by the province around essentially rapid transit locations, and in particular to the district, 2 bus exchanges, a bus exchange at Phibbs, okay, which is most folks are familiar with in Lynn Creek, and then also Capilano University. So we have 2 TOAs, or transit-oriented areas. The second acronym you'll hear me say tonight is the SSMUH, or SMU for short, and that stands for Small Scale Multi-Unit Housing. This is an acronym the province uses to describe essentially the future of infill housing. So the province has set out an objective to change the zoning in traditional single-family and duplex neighborhoods into small-scale multifamily zoning. Okay, so that I'll be referring to that tonight, and going over the particular changes and their impacts on the community. So just by way of context for members of the community, and council is well aware of this, we have had an official community plan in place since 2011. I'm not going to walk through it in any detail, but just suffice to say, council's provided direction that we've been implementing for a number of years to accommodate transit-oriented development in our town centers in areas of high amenity, in areas of growing infrastructure improvements and transit. We also have deployed a number of infill strategies over the years, including small lot infill areas. These are those small lots that are, around 30-foot frontage. We've also deployed various regulatory changes to accommodate secondary suites since the 1990s and coach houses more recently, and to expand how they're developed in the community to try to create infill opportunities. So there are actually a lot of alignment. There's a lot of alignment in terms of philosophical objectives to create infill opportunities in single-family neighborhoods and also to focus growth in transit areas. What we're talking about today, though, is a particular approach the province has taken to implement these objectives.
Is there any way to make that full screen? I think we're losing a lot of detail on it, or part of the screen.
Yeah, let's try. See if I can expand that. And maybe I'll ask the clerk.
Bottom right, Mr. Miller.
There we go. Is that more readable?
Well, if you're, 20.
They're not just a full screen. Well, that's a lot better. There you go.
Excellent. Okay. Right. So on this map, this is the land use map, which identifies the town centers and village centers where growth would be focused. And in the red is the existing and future frequent transit network connecting those various centers, as well as this also includes in some of the yellow dots, some of the smaller villages. So the growth really is focused on those 4 key centers: Lionsgate, Lynn Valley, Lynn Creek, and Maplewood. That's where the official community plan anticipated 75 to 90% of all new unit development, so residential development, would be focused in those 4 key centers. Since 2011, council, through its decisions around rezoning, has actually achieved that objective. 82% of new units have been in those 4 key centers. So that desire to focus growth has been part of council's decisions for some time.
A sustainable plan.
Good. All right. So the province and the 2 topics we're focused on, which small scale multi-unit housing, that's sometimes we refer to a component of Bill 44 from the province, introduced and received royal assent in late November, early December of last year, and transit oriented areas. Those are our 2 discussions of focus for tonight, as I mentioned. Just a scroll. So just thinking about transit-oriented areas first. What the province did is they identified through regulation in the district 2 areas, and I mentioned Phipps Exchange and Kaplan University, where density and height must be permitted by the District of North Vancouver in the measurements shown here. So within 200, for example, if we look at Phipps Exchange, parcels that are within 200 meters, and I mean any part of those parcels are within 200 meters of that bus exchange, must accommodate a density of 4 FSR and a height of 12 stories for residential development. And then lands within 200 to 400 meters of Phipps Exchange, for example, must then accommodate an FSR of 3 and a height of 8 stories for residential development. So the province, this rule actually took effect at the time of royal assent. And what the province asked is that all local governments that have TOAs that affect properties within their jurisdiction designate those lands as TOAs by June 30th. So that essentially involves a designation bylaw of council to identify that area. It is also an option for council to potentially pre-zone those areas. So zone those areas in advance of development. However, that's not a requirement. Simple designation is a requirement.
Can I just clarify one thing? Can you just clarify, Mr. Milburn, for members in the room, that this is nothing that is being forced upon. We've had a number of letters that have said, do we have to do this on our property? You don't have to do anything.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. So what this essentially the legislation does is it directs local governments on how they're to respond to applications. So that does not mean an owner must develop the property for that purpose. They could retain the existing use into the future. It's just that if that owner approaches the district, they have the right to ask for this use and density.
Having said that, because the property is now more flexible and has more density, it will probably be assessed higher and they will probably pay taxes reflecting the buildable use on the site. Therefore, there will be an incentive for them to have their use and density as closely match as possible.
But the assessment authority has not been given direction by the provincial government. They are, I understand, waiting for sales to occur to determine how the assessments will rise, which is what already happens. So if someone was to come in and build 4 units on a single family, then it would be based on that value and the assessments in the neighborhood would go up.
Yeah, it's anticipated that over time, there will be sales, there will be interest, and that will generate a market. And then the province, through BC Assessment, uses an aggregate market approach to determine the values of lands. And however, I think it's a useful assumption to agree that if the current zoning and OCP is less than this, and this TOA designation in the future applies to the property, that there will be a likelihood of potential that either a developer will speculate on and bid up the price of the property, and then that will be reflected in the assessment on an annual basis.
Just add one more little caveat to this. So if it was province is silent on stratification of properties versus rentals, so obviously the value would change. It could change quite dramatically if there was stratification. And
But we're talking about TOAs.
no, I know, but I'm just saying in general, right?
That's correct. Properties that can be stratified do have a higher value in the marketplace than properties that must be rental. Right. That's correct. So, so that's an objective of June 30th. So what we've done is we looked at the provincial legislation. This is both the statute and regulations. We worked with our legal team and our engineers and our properties team to look at, and planners of course, to look at those properties and not just draw a ring, but actually try to identify the properties that appear to be affected directly. So the red colored properties are those that are affected by within the 200-meter properties that can accommodate 12 stories for FSR of residential development. And then properties shown in that orangey yellow color are properties that are within the 400-meter area. So that's the 3 FSR or 8-story area. There are certain exemptions provided in the legislation for industrial and agricultural lands where residential uses are secondary or ancillary. And so those are excluded, lands that can't be developed because of a park as well. So this is the best available information we have at the moment. We'll be looking at this and consulting with the community as well. But essentially what we're doing is trying to translate what the provincial regulations would look like when applied to properties so that we can consult with the community and then come back to council with a designation bylaw sometime before June 30th for council's consideration.
Speak to POSNA, parks, open space and natural areas. It's obviously on the CAFU to a significant amount of land that, well, it's residential property as it's a graveyard, but other than that, what do you see parks, open space and natural areas, how do you see them being affected by the TOA?
Yeah. So most properties in the district that are parks, open space zoning are owned and managed by civic institutions. So either one of the, a college, university, school, could be, of course, the District of North Vancouver. We have very few properties that are privately owned. What we understand to be the intent is that the focus is on properties that could be developed for residential purposes. So that would exclude parks, which are not that purpose.
So Monashi Drive was a privately held POSNA, parked open space natural. It had a dog kennel on it, but that one.
That's a post-hearing matter that I can't speak to at this time.
Could you identify the size of that piece of property?
The property that's subject to 1310 Monashi, that's subject to
how big is that property?
I don't have the number off the top of my head, and as I say, I can't answer any questions related to it as it's a post-hearing matter.
Well, you can't receive any new, but you can tell the size.
Yeah, I can share information. I would look to my colleagues to pull up GeoTools and to size of the parcel.
At this time, there's no indication that's being considered for that purpose. I'm just saying there are some privately held POSNA or rec focused properties that will be excluded.
Yes, and there is one that is subject to a separate rezoning application at this time. Okay. So moving on then. So just an example, just to provide a visual of what kind of scale of development we're talking about. On the left-hand side is a typical 12-story residential development. On the right is 8-story. One of the things that I think became very clear to us as we analyzed this regulation of the province is it only talks about residential opportunity. Right? It talks about the district or local governments affected by these regulations accommodating a certain amount of residential density. We do know that when we plan our town centers, we don't just think about one use. We think about commercial uses. We think about parks uses and amenity spaces. And so when we come back with recommendations for council to consider, we'll be thinking about those topics as well. So if we designate properties for transit-oriented areas, we'll of course recommend that they accommodate the residential use required by the province, but that also there be some commercial uses, for example, on the main floor in areas where it makes sense. So that will be part of the policy recommendation that the staff will provide. So moving on to small scale multi-unit housing, Bill 44. What do we mean by this? So when I talked about earlier, I said traditional single family and duplex lots going from their existing zoning into a new zoning to accommodate small scale multi-unit housing. The provincial legislation indicates that change would mean that a single family lot of up to 3 units are permitted on lots 280 square meters or less. That's just over 3,000 square feet. Okay, so that's quite a small lot. And we actually only have just a handful of those lots. We have very few in the district of North Vancouver right now, small lots that are zoned for single family. So that's not a significant change for the district, given the very limited number of lots. The next is up to 4 units on lots greater than 280 square meters, or approximately 3,000 square feet, and up to 6 units on lots that are at least 281 square meters and are wholly or partly within 400 meters of a prescribed bus stop. And we'll show you a map next about where those 6 unit areas are. In the 6 unit areas, the district is prohibited from requiring off-street parking. So that's if there's a 6-plex, we are prohibited from requiring any parking spaces provided on that property. An owner may choose to voluntarily provide parking spaces, but we can't require it. And I guess I should have mentioned that's the same rule that applies to the TOAs as well, the transit-oriented areas. We cannot require parking spaces be provided by those developments. Also, the district has limited powers with respect to density bonus zoning that apply to 1 unit within the 6 unit areas. So a very limited regulatory opportunity to negotiate for affordable housing only on 6 unit SMUs.
I hate that acronym, SMU.
How should I refer to it?
I don't know. It's just awful. SMU.
Okay, so the province in Bill 44, and in particular in the regulation associated with to do with houses conditions, item 6, laid out those single family neighborhoods where SMU wouldn't apply. So this is a list of conditions that those areas would be exempted and that the existing zoning would prevail. So the existing single family zoning in most cases in the district would continue to govern the use and development of the property as opposed to small scale multi-unit housing. So those areas that are exempt under legislation are lots outside the urban containment boundary, and I'll show a map of where that is. It's essentially those tree lots high up in the alpine area. Properties having certain heritage designations, and that's really properties that are already protected, heritage property. As of Royal Ascent, those areas will continue to be protected in terms of density lift. Land not connected to municipal water or sewer systems are exempt. Larger lots that are that 4,050 square meters or 1 acre in size, those are exempted. Lands within the designated transit-oriented areas are exempted. Well, that's just because the higher density is accommodated there already, that regulation. And as I mentioned, hazardous condition areas. And in particular, the way the regulation defines it is that a site where the lift in density would create risk that cannot be reasonably mitigated. Okay. So we've put that question to our legal team and to our engineers who have responsibility to provide advice with respect to where are the hazardous condition areas in our community. And I have a subsequent slide where I'll describe that a little further.
Councillor Mall, you had a question. Is it on this or on the, want to see the next slide?
Wait, thank you. All right. So this is a map showing the proposed small scale multi-unit housing and the exempt areas. So what staff did is we took the provincial descriptions of exempt areas and we've tried to analyze the existing parcels in the district and identify the areas that would be exempt under those provincial rules. And so those are the areas shown in orange. And again, that includes those large lots, lands that are not within the urban containment, or sorry, lands that, and the urban containment boundary is this pink line you see here. So lands outside of that, small scale multi-unit housing is exempted. And what you are left with is essentially the yellow and the red lots. The yellow lots identify potential 4-unit small scale multi-unit housing based on their size. And then the red lots shown here and here, outlined in blue, are the areas where potentially 6-unit small scale multifamily housing could be accommodated under the provincial rules. Again, this is the best information we have at this stage. If the province changes the legislation or regulations, we'll adapt to that at that time. One of the things that's quite notable here is there's a significant area of orange, and in part that's because of the defined hazard areas. And so staff have taken the time to define areas in the community where the risk increase in density cannot be reasonably mitigated at this time. And we base that on an assessment of the hazardous condition areas, sort of the natural hazards in the community, in particular, the creek hazard areas, so areas prone to flood, slope hazard areas, these are areas prone to landslip, and the wildfire hazard areas, these are areas that interface or can be affected by wildfire. And staff have determined at this stage that it makes sense to, at this time, based on the best information we have now, to exempt those areas from small-scale multifamily housing. Now, it's a point in time. We may, of course, receive more information in the future about, say, increasing hazards in the community. If we learn more about increasing hazards, we would identify those exempt areas. Or if we learn about and implement mitigation measures in these areas that may reduce the amount of exempt area. So this is something that could be not static, but fluid based on our understanding and the changing nature of hazards in the community. And I'll look to my engineering team to see if they wanted to add any other comments.
I think just one thing to add, this is an area that we've spent a lot of time over many years looking at natural hazards, and the more that we learn, obviously the more that we update what the province has provided to us in terms of what the future could look like for our community is obviously a new thing that we need to take and analyze and work through. So unfortunately, the timeline doesn't let us complete all of that work, but as Jan alluded to, as we find out more information, we'll continue to refine what this map will look like.
I'm just gonna zoom back up again, just so folks can look at the small scale multi-unit housing areas. So again, the areas in yellow, quite significant amount of area, and the areas in red. And the type of housing, just to give folks a visual representation of the type of housing the province has indicated could be accommodated in those areas, is this general type of form. Again, I think the point taken earlier, mentioned by Councillor Murray, is it doesn't require that people tear down their house and build this. They could still continue to occupy, use their home, and rebuild their home for single-family purposes, or single-family and duplex, or single-family duplex and coach house, for example, other forms of housing. However, with small-scale multi-unit housing, it essentially would create a zoning allowance for this form. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because the province has introduced some policy guidance that local governments must consider in terms of changes to the urban form in order to accommodate this. I'll describe that in a subsequent slide. So, what we will be consulting with the community on and seeking council's direction on before June 30th is not just a map showing where small-scale multifamily housing can be accommodated, but new small-scale multi-unit housing zoning. So that zoning would control things like height, setbacks, parking standards, and so on. So staff's preliminary assessment of the provincial policies and our assessment of existing lots in the district seem to identify that we'll need to adjust the zoning and to have small-scale multi-unit housing that can accommodate 3 stories and more gross floor area in order to build that 4 or 6 units. Okay? So increased height is anticipated and a 3rd story. We also anticipate it would be beneficial to have partial or no basements as a change in our standard, and really to encourage those units to be above ground, or at least partially above ground, for livability reasons, but also because of the impact that we do know and have experienced in the community to effects on groundwater, and also to the amount of significantly large excavations that disturb a larger portion of the property. So those are just examples of some of the impacts that having full basements can create.
That will increase the height.
Correct, increase the height 3 stories. The province anticipates that heights in the range of 10 to 11 meters in height would be in the range that could accommodate this kind of density. The heights that we currently have in our single family zones are more in the range of 6.5 or 6.7 meters up to 8.5 meters. So that's a significant increase and change. However, that's what the province is recommending.
But at this point, that's a recommendation. The law of the land is still our requirement.
Correct.
From all your comments?
Yeah, I'm just looking at this and it talks about, maximum 4 to 6 units. I think most people would agree that there's a need for affordable housing. There's going to be changes in the community. Dan, I'm wondering if you can speak to what's the relationship between the housing targets given to us by the provincial government of 38 units and what's going on with the TOAs and the Shmoosh. How does that all relate? Where are we going to end up with how many units potentially?
Yes. So the province, which took effect on October 1st, 2023, for the benefit of folks in the gallery, have identified the district needing to demonstrate an approval and occupancy of about 2,838 units over the coming 5 years, and to report on that in the first 6 months and then annually thereafter for that 5-year period. The number of units is not specific to affordability. It is simply number of units. At the same time that the province provided that target, they also provided guidance in the form of a suggestion, if you will, for amount of affordability, amount of rental units, and various other descriptions of that housing. So we have for many years, the district has had objectives about estimated demand that we know we need to accommodate for affordable rental units and so on. And so this is nothing new to us. And so we'll be reporting on that information after the first 6 months. So coming up in the coming weeks, we'll have a report to council which will describe how we're working towards those targets. Now, how it relates to these areas is if we create additional capacity for small scale multi-unit housing, that essentially means there's more opportunity for people to build without having to go through say, a rezoning process. So we're really just creating a more capacity in the community to accommodate future development and having reduced amount of approval process. There'd be less rezonings if people wanted to build this kind of form. So it's really creating opportunity to achieve that target. It doesn't force that target to occur. It just creates opportunity for it to occur. And that would be both in the transit-oriented areas, as well as in the small-scale multifamily housing areas, as well as every area of the community. All the units that get created and built would be towards our target.
Councilor Miri, you had an additional comment?
Well, I just wanted to add to this is more about supply than it is about affordability, because the province has also taken away our ability to negotiate affordable units into multifamily or higher density properties.
That's right. I would agree with that statement that the focus of small scale multi-unit housing and transit-oriented housing is the creation of more supply. The province has indicated that they feel across the province, and I'll show those numbers in a subsequent slide, across the province, this initiative could result in more units, which they say and they argue would result in a moderation of the demand supply equation. And therefore, we'd have more cost-effective housing because we'd have more supply. That's the argument they've presented. Certainly the challenge from our perspective is some of those tools you mentioned, the density bonus zoning tool that we've used very effectively in negotiations with properties. By reducing our ability to use that tool, it means there's less chance for us to achieve our affordable housing objectives on private projects. So one of the key feedbacks we gave to the province is there another tool that can help us address that? And as mentioned in the staff report, there has been some public discussion about inclusionary zoning. We don't know the full scope of that, and we haven't seen the legislation yet. But that is apparently an opportunity on the horizon. The other, of course, is what we actively go for as well, which is provincial funding. So we look for provincial funding opportunities to develop district lands for affordability, and we'll continue to do that.
I just have one more question on that. Our official community plan focused on density in our town centers to be able to service those areas. This is basically adding units to what was once called a community of sprawl. The district is sprawled because we spread out. So we've looked at densifying. Now the costs attached to this kind of density throughout the municipality That's gonna obviously add significant cost to anybody that's interested in building a building like this in a single family neighborhood. Because some of our areas are challenged already. So what do we know what those modeling numbers are in regards to the costs? We're gonna have to add.
I have on the very next
Oh,
slide, I
sorry.
start into
Okay.
that conversation. So.
And just before you question, Councilor Moss, a question on this slide.
Just a follow-up question. The housing targets have unit types and 10-year goals, I believe, and
The targets?
yeah, the housing targets.
The guidelines.
Guidelines.
So there isn't a target for unit type.
But guidelines.
Guidelines.
You want 2 bedrooms or rentals.
Affordable units, rental
Right.
units, yeah, they're guidelines.
Traditionally, when we have a developer come before us, we can try to influence that as well.
That's right.
Will the district have any ability to influence the unit type in POs, TOWs, or SHMOs?
Yeah, one of the opportunities that we'll be discussing with the public and council can consider is rental tenure zoning. So the province has indicated that both for transit-oriented areas as well as small-scale multifamily housing, council could apply rental tenure zoning such that, you know, the second, third, fourth unit, for example, would need to be occupied by a renter. That is something that council could do to try to achieve its objectives for rental units in the community.
And could we say in those units, does it need to have at least 1 2-bedroom? Be able to go to that as well.
No, yeah, the province hasn't indicated that is one of the our requirements. The policy guidelines they provided is essentially you have to accommodate a certain number of units. And then, of course, we have our zoning power, which lets us control height and massing and so on. Numbers of bedrooms by type is something that we typically negotiate through rezoning. So if there's a rezoning process attached to it, when it's outside of a rezoning process, it's typically what occurs and what market demand there is. Interestingly, the District of North Vancouver has been very successful in achieving family-oriented units. So these are units with 2, 3, or 4 bedroom. When we compare ourselves to our neighboring jurisdictions, like the city of North Vancouver, we have closer to 2/3 of all our units being family-oriented, and that's really a reflection both of council's decisions through the rezoning process, but also the market demand. We're very much a family-oriented community, as opposed to, I'm not saying not family-oriented, but smaller families. So singles and twosomes are more common in other more urbanized communities. Just to finish this slide, some of the other zoning issues that we'll be tackling in this conversation and in response to the provincial policies are whether or not we can take advantage of certain lots that have lane access or flanking streets with different kinds of configurations that accommodate density to access off of those flanking streets or lanes. And also, we think there's likely going to be some changes to site layout, such as front and rear yard setbacks, and to allow some form flexibility for 4-unit and 6-unit developments in order to get enough mass to accommodate all those units in that project. So again, quite significant change to our traditional single-family zones are anticipated in order to accommodate.
So on that, especially on these little lots, on Mount Seymour Parkway, for instance, there's a lot at the corner of Beaufort and Mount Seymour Parkway. And one of those little, it's a 3,300 or 3,600 square foot lot.
25 wide.
Yeah, 25 wide, so the mayor could hold his arms out and touch wall to wall. And it's listed right now it's listed for 1.6 in 2018, it's listed for $2 million right now. But its neighbor has the same square footage, the house is exactly the same next door, but in order to get to the neighbor's garage, you have to cross the first house because there's no access from Mount Seymour Parkway. Because engineering doesn't want, for the rebuilds, they want to change how you access onto those properties because of the roadway. So some of these houses automatically will be exempt because you cannot access them by a car. Because there's no more space to put any more units on a little 3,000 square foot lot if you want to have a vehicle in an area like, you know, the Seymour where buses go by regularly and there's shopping everywhere. We don't need any.
No. Your worship, I think it's a good point that there will be many sites that have physical constraints of some nature or another. Certainly, it's been said before in the transit-oriented areas, we have great big servicing power lines that run through some of those areas. In some areas, there might be a river or an escarpment that might be undevelopable. So there will be conditions and limitations to physically what can fit on a site. And that will be essentially the market will take care of that kind of limitation, just or the simple physical constraints on the site. However, the way the province has written the legislation is that once it's identified as a small scale multifamily housing area, we wouldn't be able to use normally our zoning tools to sort of prohibit that amount of density being achieved on the site. So it might be that on some sites there are very small units in order that they can get the amount of density that the zoning will allow. And for the 6-unit areas, 0 parking requirement.
Wow. There goes the neighborhood.
Councilor Forbes.
Throwing something else out there. I know about the setbacks in order to allow the smaller lots to be able to densify on the lot. It's due to all of our tree canopy bylaws.
So the tree permit bylaw essentially allows folks to have a justification to cut the tree down based on the building envelope. And so if we allow larger building envelopes to accommodate 4 and 6 units, that may mean some impacted trees on the property.
Maybe.
Most likely, I guess is what I should say, probably a better way to phrase it, most likely result in increased volume means increased impact to the property. Which is in part one of the reasons why we think a recommendation to try to lift those units higher to reduce the amount of excavation that might need to occur would probably make some sense as well. However, there will be impacts, no doubt. This will impact both the physical form as well as the physical development of those properties. Yes.
Have we had those type of environmental and tree canopy type conversations and how?
Yeah, so we haven't analyzed that at this stage. Our focus up to this point has been trying to understand the scope of the changes both in terms of zoning and policy. I think there will be many of those types of issues that will arise along the way. Another potential offsite impact, especially in the areas where no parking is required, like off-street parking, is what are the on-street parking standards? How should they be modified, either time limited or pay parking, to try to ensure that those folks who maybe don't have parking on the site don't just consume the parking on the street. So there's many consequential impacts. You mentioned the one, the trees, parking is another. There's also key questions around development approval. Should we have a development permit process for looking at the aesthetic of these small scale multifamily housing or not? Or should we have simply staff issued development permits? That's a key question going forward. Not something for today, but certainly something going forward that we'll want to provide advice to council on, is what will be the process of approval for these units as well. So there's many other those types of issues that will come up along the way.
I just wanted to clarify, when you say no parking required, that doesn't mean that it's a requirement to have no parking. It means that we cannot limit the minimum number of parking stalls. If a developer chooses to add parking stalls, that's their choice. We won't be able to force them to, and we won't be able to regulate them, which has the unintended consequence of, all of our electrification of parking stalls was brought through by us regulating parking stalls. And so now the provincial government has restricted our ability to bring that in.
Sure. So in legislation, what they did leave in the transit-oriented areas is our ability to require parking for folks for accessible parking was an allowance they put in. And we put the question to them as well, can we still require bicycle parking? And the answer they came back with was yes. So we found that interesting, but probably consistent with their objectives for active transportation in transit-oriented areas. So that was the answer they gave us. The act isn't incredibly clear on that topic, but that's the answer from the province. Additionally, the legislation does say that if a owner voluntarily provides parking spaces, we can control the standard of those spaces. So their dimension, their surfacing, for example, like asphalt surface. The reason is, and I think it makes sense, is we don't want gravel parking lots in the middle of our urban areas. That doesn't make sense. That would create dust and other problems. So the province is allowing us to continue to regulate, voluntarily provide standards.
Can we just clarify the timing of the question that Councillor Forbes had in regards to the canopy? So we're bringing bylaws forward in June.
For June.
But why wouldn't we include the canopy in what it does for our community, our neighborhoods in regards to the dealing with water, holding up many of the hills that we all live on, for instance. We've had significant outpouring of community members. Large stands are removed for just a single family home, let alone a mini apartment in a single family neighborhood. So I'd like to understand from engineering what the removal of, because we're going to be adding a significant amount of hard surface as this goes forward, and we recognize it's not going to all happen at once. It'll happen over time. But we've seen what speculation does in this community. So, you know, who's to say that it's not going to happen as it did in the last 10 years? So I think we need to understand the displacement of water and the loss of our canopy within the context of those bylaws.
And I can say that certainly as staff, we would probably not have the time to do the full level analysis that I think you're suggesting in terms of understanding groundwater impacts in relationship to loss of trees.
But we already have a lot of that information.
Yeah, we could probably have a high level assessment of looking at if we went from, you know, a certain lot coverage, say 20 to 30%, and you change that closer to 35 to 40%, 50%, what that increased lot coverage might mean in terms of globally how much land disturbance you might have. Again, there's a lot of speculation attached to this because we know every one of the lots that are affected by small scale multifamily housing won't just change overnight. It will be a gradual shift over time. So we can, at this stage, we have very little time and we could only do a very cursory high level assessment of potential impact. We'd have to monitor over time and provide feedback to council.
Just my final point though, Mr. Millward, would be that we're losing the canopy already. We're losing it to climate change, forest fires, moth, increased development already in our urban, and we can't really afford to lose any more. So we need to actually, Metro Vancouver is actually moving to try to increase it and protect what we've got. So I you know, regardless of whether it happens now or over the next 10, 20 years, our job is that we plan for the future and we make sure that those things are dealt with. So I think it's as important as, you know, it certainly is going to be what the design of a parking stall is for me. So I do want us to look at that.
And staff are taking those notes and we'll make sure to bring that back as we have future conversations around our ecosystems and ecological diversity. I know that's a big topic with our team.
Sir Forbes, were you finished with your questions? Can I ask you to come take over the chair? You're the acting mayor right now, and if you take over that. Council, we're about 2/3 of the way through the slides. I highly recommend that we press through the slides and then have open discussion after that time. When we do get to the end, there are two public speakers. Because you don't have.
Thank you. Right, so moving on, this is to discuss some of the utility, transportation, other servicing challenges. District staff have been working in this very short time frame to try to get a handle on some of the impacts associated with the implementation of small scale multi-unit housing in transit-oriented areas. I'll share that information with council tonight. And I'll just say, no doubt, if we are to develop in the amount that can be accommodated, like if we were to build out all of these units, really radical changes would need to occur in these existing local neighborhoods in order to accommodate that amount of density. And that would be both transportation and utility infrastructure, water, sanitary, and storm. However, the complexity is we know that it will occur over time in a moderated way based on market demand. but we don't know exactly what that will be yet. So our assessment is necessarily having to be broad, but also, not necessarily capturing all of the issues of this time. We know we're going to learn along the way, and we're going to need to adapt with new information. What we can share tonight is that the preliminary servicing assessment of this small scale multi-unit housing has identified a couple broad areas that if they were zoned to accommodate small scale multi-unit housing, we would need to think about various strategies to deal with the infrastructure demand. So the couple colors you see here, again, the orange is that exempt area that I identified earlier, so that's shown in this map as well. The areas shown in green, and that includes both 4-unit and 6-unit areas, they are areas where servicing is likely feasible. Okay, so based on our preliminary assessment, that does not mean automatically all those areas could be fully built out. There would need to be some improvements, but it's likely more feasible than other areas. And therefore, those are areas that we would probably, for that reason, probably want to encourage through both our development approval processes, making them streamlined, as well as potentially accommodation of stratified development in those areas, because those areas make most sense from a servicing and accessing perspective based on our preliminary analysis. The other colored area, the areas shown in blue, are areas where servicing is likely more challenging. These are areas where we have known limitations in terms of water, sewer, and storm infrastructure. It's also farther away from the highway and highway infrastructure that can access for a movement of goods and people. So we have identified these areas because we think there might need to be different types of mitigation responses. In the area that are green, where we can more likely accommodate growth, we may want to encourage small scale multi-unit housing. In the areas in blue, we may want to consider various mitigation strategies to try to give us time to more accurately assess the impact on infrastructure and to collect the resources necessary to pay for those improvements through such tools as development cost charges and amenity cost charges. So again, at a high level perspective, the orange are kind of no-go areas where we wouldn't encourage smooth, they would be exempt. The green are areas where we think it can be most likely accommodated and potentially encouraged, and the blue are the more challenging areas. Our preliminary assessment. So looking at those areas, one of the things we asked ourselves are how many units could you generate? How many units could be built in those areas based on that changed capacity? And whether or not that was consistent with the provincial government's stated objectives. So they've said they want to accommodate a certain number of units globally across the province. Would these areas accommodate that kind of growth? So in particular, provinces said for transit-oriented areas, they anticipate across the whole province, this is not just the district, so across the whole province, that in communities where transit-oriented areas apply, they anticipate about 100,000 new units could be generated through the application of transit-oriented areas. So doing a simple mathematical equation, what would be our number relative to our population of around 90,000? Well, that equates to about 1,800 units. And if we look at the 2 transit-oriented areas and we do a very quick and dirty analysis of what those areas could accommodate, if all the lands within those TOAs were redeveloped to the density accommodated by the province, you could definitely achieve essentially the proportional amount the province anticipates should the district could accommodate. So essentially, we're not saying we will see those 5,500 units. We're not saying that will happen. We're just saying from a simple high-level planning analysis perspective, the TOA areas we have identified could accommodate what the province thinks would be the district's share of growth. Okay. So then we did a similar analysis for the small-scale multi-unit housing. And in that case, the province said that they thought small-scale multi-unit housing across the province would accommodate additional 100,000 units. That's all the communities that would apply to. The district's per capita share, 2,300 units. And the theoretical maximum that those small scale multi-unit housing designation shows is a net new 22,000 units. So a significant amount of units could be accommodated. So that raises really important considerations for us. If you have a very spread out area where you can accommodate significant amount of density, that creates significant servicing challenges potentially if those units develop in a very dispersed pattern. It's challenging to try to service all those areas when they're spread out like that. If they, however, if the market actually responds to this and says, well, the best areas are in this one spot close to a town center, and that's where all the development seems to occur, that's a much easier thing to plan for and to manage. So the challenge we have is the provincial rules don't distinguish between those two circumstances. It just small scale multifamily housing will be applied and then the market will respond and we'll have to adjust to the market. So one of the key considerations that we will be coming back to council with before June 30th and well, before the summer actually, is recommendations for various tools such as development cost charge changes and amenity cost charge bylaw to be put in place so we can capture value off of the small scale multifamily housing units as they're constructed to try to ensure that we can pay for the infrastructure. Okay.
I just have a quick
Council
question.
meeting.
Is First Nations land captured in any of this?
Yeah, so the provincial legislation specifically excludes Indigenous lands from the application of small scale multi-unit housing, and transit-oriented areas don't apply either.
So their existing reserves are not captured by this, but either is their development lands, they're not captured by this.
Yeah, so the Indigenous communities will have their own plans, some of which have been published in the paper, long-term plans about redeveloping in their property. And whatever we do in terms of planning for infrastructure, we will need to also consult with and have conversations about how the servicing and transportation issues can be managed collectively. I think that's where you're going with the question is, how can we respond to these issues collectively? Because we know that certainly when it comes down to regional transportation infrastructure, we won't be successful if it's just us asking for it. We need to work with our partners such as Indigenous communities in order to achieve that objective.
Well, I think we need to also understand the number of units that they're contemplating on their developable lands because they've got significant holdings and, you know, they're in some of their plans in Vancouver, for instance, Jericho, you know, the density is a significant, it will be a significant impact to that area and the transportation over the bridges, et cetera.
Acting Mayor Forbes, we don't have a tremendous amount of time to do all that we would like to do by June 30th, but certainly as part of the upcoming conversations around the housing needs report, the official community plan amendment and the rezoning bylaw changes that are required over the next year and a half,
We can amend.
we need to talk very carefully with all our partners on the North Shore because the other municipalities will be going through the exact same process as well, talking about increase in density. And so we need to work with our Indigenous partners as well as the municipality, other municipalities on the North Shore to understand the full scope. And so that
Schools, hospitals,
schools,
bridges,
hospitals, as well as municipal infrastructure as well.
those little things.
We have infrastructure that crosses municipal lines, and so we will need to think about those issues. Absolutely.
Major challenges.
I think I heard you just say that staff will be recommending changes to the DCCs by the end of June.
Before summertime, we'll have recommendations to council.
So are you referring to an increase? Is that what you mean by that? An increase in DCCs to help fund the added infrastructure costs of increased density?
We think initially we'll have, and I'll refer to Rick to jump in here too if I say anything out of staff. His team is looking after the update to the bylaw. For the first step, we are looking, so before summer, we're looking to come back with recommendations on changes to development cost charges and likely to increase to deal with the known growth, even before small scale multifamily housing and transit-oriented areas are in place. We know that there is a increased growth related to meeting our targets as well as our anticipated growth through the OCP. And there will be increased infrastructure costs that we'll want to accommodate. And the additional changes that the province made to DCCs were to create the ability to charge for infrastructure such as growth-related costs for fire halls and for police stations, for example. And so the question before us will be, in the future, do we want to plan for that and collect fees from that from development to fund those pieces of infrastructure? So the very first step, though, will be recommending essentially creating the bylaws and creating amended cost charge bylaws in place to reflect known growth. Okay, and then as we learn more about the potential changes that will come with small scale multifamily housing and transit-oriented areas, we're likely to see a refinement of those numbers over time. So council will see it likely multiple times in the coming months and years. And because we do know that if you add density, you increase demand for services and infrastructure. And we'll have to be flexible and adaptable to try to identify those projects and to put in financial mechanisms to help fund them. DCCs and ACCs being the principal ways to do that. So you will see what I would call a first step by the summer to reflect known growth, and then we'll need to refine that number as we learn more about how much growth we think we're going to see with small scale multi-unit housing. We're not going to see 22,000 units right away, right? It will be incremental over time, and we don't want to, assume that will all be built out right away. We need to come up with some good advice for council about how much construction absorption we're going to see in the community. We all know there's lots of headwinds in the construction industry, labor costs, material costs, all those things. And so it's challenging to estimate exactly, but we will provide some guidance and some recommendations for council.
I have another question, which is in relation to the servicing assessment. And so you've got in blue here, the servicing likely challenging areas.
Sure.
So the blues are more challenging areas because of why? What criteria was used to determine that exactly? Because I heard you mention transit, and that seems to me that you've included a pretty broad scope in servicing likely challenges.
And I have some of the experts in the room, so I will look to them to provide some feedback if I can. Back to Mayor Forbes, go to Andy Bell.
Your worship. This assessment is primarily done based on the district's utility modelling work, which means we've primarily looked at water servicing and sanitary servicing. We've not completed, say, transportation's servicing yet or modelling yet to assess where the transportation capacity restraints lie. But that is work that we do plan to be doing. So again, primarily this is about water and sanitary servicing. So for example, can we provide the adequate fire flow that is required, the adequate flow of water during a fire to the localized hydrants in any one area for the new form of housing. So a single family house requires a certain amount of water, and a multi-family house requires a higher amount of water. So immediately we have to question, can we provide that higher flow of water today? This is one example of where we've identified some servicing constraints that we would need to remedy before we could issue building permits for.
So my understanding then is if once you include transit, the blue zones are going to increase.
It could.
It could.
And just supplement, it means that the primary assessment has been the water and sanitary services. The one thing we'll note, so the green areas, remember, are the areas where more likely you can accommodate snow. So the blue line are the frequent transit areas defined by the province, and you can see they generally encapsulate the areas that are more easily to service.
If I may add, just that the work done to date, it's a very high level. So there might be pockets that change. The green and the blue may change as we do further analysis. And just because we have the area green, which is kind of likely more feasible to service. It does not mean that we do not need to do upgrades. There may well need to be upgrades in those areas. Those upgrades could be costly, and we will need to have conversations around that as we move forward.
Can we just, do we, when we're modeling this for water especially, are we looking at worst case scenarios in the height of the summer? When we've been on drought watch for 3 months. I mean, Seashelt ran out of water last year. You know, they're gonna run out again this year. Our snowpack is at 55% of normal. And we don't have plans to expand our watersheds on the North Shore. We don't have the capacity to hold more water. So do we model this in a normal time of year? Or are we modeling this when we haven't had water and the dams are lowering?
The district's engineering standards for fire protection do not relate to the amount of water in reservoirs. It's straight up how much water can our system deliver to a single hydrant. And that needs to be a specified amount. And so that then has the assumption that we have the reservoir capacity. Now I say the assumption, we design our reservoirs to have our own.
It's a risky assumption, Mr. Bell, given the climate change.
That's how municipal systems are designed across the province and probably.
Okay, so that's one facet of it. But I think that my question would be, with all of this new sprawl, are we going to be able to accommodate the simple and right of every human being on this planet, I would say, although many don't have what we have, the necessity of water?
Yeah, I think just to add to Mr. Bell, we're not the only municipality or the only regional government that's dealing with this. It's a valid question in terms
Provincial.
of it's provincial, it's regional. Metro Vancouver, they're the ones that supply us with the water. We as a municipality have, we oversee just the pipes that are in our ground, and they connect to Metro Vancouver assets. And so Metro Vancouver is also dealing with this issue as well. As Dan's alluded to before, we have very, very short timelines. And so in a traditional approach, we would have loved to have done all these assessments, made a really good due diligence in terms of the decisions that we're making. The province has provided us with June 30th.
We need to share those concerns that we have, and I know you have, Mr. Milburn, and certainly Metro has too. But these timelines pushing us into a corner on these very critical questions for the future, not for us. We'll all be long gone when this is built out, if it actually happens. But it's very, very concerning what we're facing. Mr. Milburn?
All right, moving to the next slide. And I started to discuss this earlier, but just for completeness sake, there are a number of factors that are going to limit the uptake in the transit-oriented area and the small-scale multifamily housing, both regulations and standards, for servicing of it and the infrastructure. There might be environmental or physical constraints that mean that the property couldn't be necessarily developed to the full density. Services has been mentioned, ownership and tenure, and market-related factors. There's lots of things out there that will govern essentially how quickly of an uptake we see in the developed areas. The zoning change will only be one factor in that conversation. So, I went really fast. Okay, so I wanted to speak about some of the financial impacts to the district. So as has already been pointed out, there will potentially be large infrastructure investments needed to deliver in a declarative and sequential manner new infrastructure to accommodate this growth. The district needs to really, at this stage, we need to further quantify and understand the impacts on the community. And we need to come back with advice for council about changes to various financial tools that we have in place, such as I mentioned earlier, dwelling cost charges and amenity cost charges. I note, and as been noted earlier, amenity cost charges will no longer be allowed to be used for affordable housing. So there will be a key question we'll put before council around the existing reserves and how the existing reserves would be allocated prior to the implementation of amenity cost charge bylaw, which would be more constrained in how council's flexibility and how it spends that money. That would be a key conversation. And also, really at this stage, because when we speak to the assessment authority and we ask them, what will be the change in people's property values, there's a bit of a response that, well, they're going to have to evaluate the market. So they're gonna have to see how these properties transfer and sell. And then on an aggregated basis, they come up with a value assessment. I would anticipate that, as I've said previously to council, I think on February 12th, some areas of the community will be just easier to develop. The lots will be flat, rectangular in size, easy access, good servicing already in place. Those areas are likely to see investment by developers sooner. Other neighborhoods, it might be more challenging, so that we could see that. And then we could see that the price of those lands will moderate based on the speculator's interest in developing those lands. And however, we don't have a clear picture of that yet. And I don't think anybody in the province has a clear picture of that yet. And so the potential impacts on taxpayers at this stage is not wholly known. We don't know exactly what the impacts will be on value. Because this is a new thing. This is a new thing in law, and this is a new thing for communities to adapt to. The communities where we have seen this kind of zoning go into place internationally, they have seen, I would describe as modest uptake of small scale multi-unit housing, in part because it's a new form of housing. It isn't the usual kind of zoning and the usual kind of development we've seen. And so we're likely to see incremental growth in this demand over time. The next slide has to do with, I think we've all been waiting for, a conversation around community engagement, because we want to inform the community of these changes and the potential impacts. And Expert Forbes, if I can call on Carolyn Grafton, our Director of Strategic Communications and Community Relations, just to present to council the anticipated public engagement and then respond to questions.
Good evening, council, and good evening, members.
Pick up your.
I need to speak up. I have a little
Do you want to come here?
I may just stand up if
There you
that's
go.
okay, because being loud is not one of my strong
I'll
suits.
teach you how to be loud.
So when we talked to council back in February 12th, we said was the workshop that we had, council was quite keen to make sure that the public was educated and aware as to what was going on with the province and the legislative changes that were being brought forward. So members of the public and council will likely remember that we issued a community bulletin at that time. And essentially we just said to members of the public, here are some changes that are coming up. It's the law, we will be responding. We encourage you to get informed, stay in touch, and we will be coming back to you when we have more information to share about what the district, what staff are actually assessing. The timelines are tight and we were encouraging people to pay attention. And we also had a sign up available for them there so that they could actually sign up on our website to be getting information as we enter into this next stage. So now it is the spring and we're about to start going back out to the public now. So we have heard feedback from council and from members of the public over time. So as Mayor Little mentioned at the beginning, we are doing 4 information sessions. We really consider this to be the start of our public engagement. We've got members of the public here. We know that there are members virtually joining us as well. So tonight was sort of our kickoff to a public conversation about these things. But we have 4 events coming up. 2 of them are in person and 2 of them are virtual. We will get council all of the times, but off the top of my head, we have our first one is a virtual event, which is April the 10th at noon. Because we know that some people have given us feedback in the past that during the evening is a challenging time for them. So we have one that's happening in the at noon. The next event is on a Thursday, April 11th at Parkgate. Then we have another virtual event, April 16th at 6:30, and then followed by another in-person event here actually at the hall on Wednesday, April 17th, again in the evening. The format of these are not an open house. It's going to be a presentation and then questions, and then staff are available. We'll have boards with the maps and things like that as well, so that people can go up and get that detailed information. And so then we'll have staff there as well, so that people can ask questions at the presentation, but we also know that they will have detailed questions about how it may affect them, their neighborhood, their property, that sort of thing. So staff will be available there as well. And to make people aware of these public information sessions, we have signs going up in the community at a lot of the major intersections. There will also be, so the bigger signs that the council is used to us putting up, we also have smaller signs going elsewhere in neighborhoods. We have digital ads going in the North Shore News, as well as print ads going in the North Shore News. Signs are going up tomorrow. The ad in the North Shore News is also happening tomorrow to give people as much notice as possible about the events coming up. And then we've got lots of different things going on, pardon me. We've got web content, of course. Our intent is we know that not everybody will want to come out to an event, or that the times may not work for everyone. So on the first virtual event that we're doing on April the 10th, our intent is to record that and then post it on the website, so that people can also watch as it suits them. They can watch multiple times, they can watch at a time that suits them, that sort of thing. And for people that did sign up after they received the community bulletin, they will also receive an email tomorrow morning directly letting them know when the various information sessions are, if they choose to come to that. And then of course, we've got information online, and that will continue. So as conversations go, as the presentation goes, that's where like the April 10th event will be, and that sort of thing. We will also use all of the channels that we have. So social media will be doing paid ads, and also just regular posts on social media to let people know. So we have a mix of physical things like the newspaper and signs, versus also digital things, depending on how people tend to get information about the district.
Are we using our libraries or our rec commission buildings to post
So
anything?
posters and things like that, that's certainly something that we can look at, yeah. What else do I have to tell you about? Really, the focus here is on making sure that people are aware of the legislation, but also the district's response to the legislation, and to educate them on what we are looking to do and what the FIPO team has done so far.
So what was the date of the last meeting at the hall here?
That's April 17th at 6:30. So again, we'll put this in writing and get this to all of council, but just so you know, that's the date.
Do you expect that there might be, depending on the feedback or how many people come out or come virtually, do you expect that there may be anything more, or do you expect it'll all be handled in these 4 meetings?
Well,
Going to the end of the month.
Yeah. So we have a date on reserve for an additional virtual meeting if we need that. The virtual meetings also have no cap on participation. The fewer people that are there, the more robust conversation that they will have, obviously. But those are facilitated sessions, and as many people can attend as they want to. But then we do have an additional date on hold if that ends up meeting. That's right.
Councillor Mary,
That was my question, just about the cap. No, I don't think we should have a cap, but I think as just a standard approach is that we should put this kind of information in our rec centers and libraries. Those are where most people gather, and you get a captive audience, people waiting around or coming in and out. So we should have boards or something up about this information and how they can access it.
And when will those dates be going on the website?
Tomorrow morning.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Very much. The one point I would make from just a planning perspective in engagement, having been involved in sweeping policy shifts such as this and sweeping legislative changes, we'll have information in these maps so people can see how specifically it might affect their property. But at the end of the day, when we have a policy recommendation in front of council, we won't be able to laboriously go through every lot in the district and say whether it's correct. and receive feedback from each person and have a debate about each site. Folks may look at the map and say, hey, this doesn't work for me, here's why, and we'll make sure council has all that information so you can make decisions about these sweeping policy and zoning changes. But just like when council approves an official community plan, you don't hear from a list of 500 people all wanting to change the designation from one designation to another. Similarly, this process won't be able to accommodate a site-by-site conversation with each owner. So that's just a bit of a limitation in terms of policy development.
People can call in and talk to you about. their
Absolutely.
particular project.
And when they meet with us at those public meetings that were discussed, or write into us and indicate, and we've already had some of that already, council has seen, some folks are saying, hey, this doesn't work for me and here's why. And so we want to make sure that all the information is provided to council so that you, when you make big policy decisions and bylaw decisions, you can weigh and balance all those factors. Okay, so our last slide in terms of next steps. We'll be commencing in-person and virtual sessions, as has been mentioned, to obtain that feedback and provide that to council. And then in early June, we anticipate that we'll have bylaws back before council for council's consideration and approval to designate transit-oriented areas, to implement small-scale multi-unit zoning bylaws, and any related bylaw amendments brought forward at that same time. For example, if there are some mitigation approaches that need to be implemented, changes to the district's utility bylaws, for example, we'll present those at the same time so council can see a complete package. And the deadline for adoption of the transit-oriented area designation and small-scale multi-unit housing is June 30th of this year. So again, a very tight timeline. We will do our absolute best to make sure that all the folks who come out and participate have an effective contribution and participation so that we can share that information to council so that you can make the decisions for the community.
Just looking at your timeline, does that mean that the public feedback will be provided to council most likely in May? Because you're going to want early June to come back with bylaws.
Yeah, we'll be able to summarize it by the time we prepare the staff reports. There'll be summaries, but that won't stop, information just continue to come in, and we'll share that with council whenever it comes in.
Thank you. Councilor Mira?
I'm really worried about this the canopy with this and the time that you guys have to deal with it. We can bring amendments to these bylaws at any time after these are adopted.
No, once a small scale multi-unit housing is created, it is forever.
Are you kidding?
No, that's the way the legislation is written. What that means,
Zoning, right?
yeah, in terms of zoning potential, the small scale multi-unit housing zoning creates a potential for numbers of units. Forevermore, council will need to accommodate that number of units through zoning. Now, the zoning could change, but the amount of density accommodated by small scale multifamily housing will be into the future.
So how do we deal with the canopy between now and June?
Yeah, so as I said, we're going to take that away and we're going to look at aggregated information. If we increase the amount of site coverage, we'll be able to provide some estimates about the scale of the potential impact to the existing canopy, but it'll be at a high level assessment.
I'm not sure that a high level assessment is enough, and I appreciate the timing on this, but I think we need to talk to the mayor about this and determine a way forward, because I think this is a significant issue that the province, there's so many nuances to this, there's so many issues, and the fact that they are not giving us any extra time to deal with any of these things is, I think, an abdication of their responsibility as the government in this province. I'm stunned that an urban tree canopy is not on their list of critical processes going forward to make sure that it's protected. Well, I wish we had known that at the beginning. I did not understand that these bylaws couldn't be amended. We amend bylaws all the time. It's what we do. I had no idea that once these bylaws are written and they are processed, that there's no change in them at all.
For small scale multi-unit housing, it's essentially the amount of density, those 4 or 6 units, will need to be accommodated in whatever zone is applied to the property. So theoretically, in the example of, let's say, somebody consolidates 4 or 5 lots together, and they want to redevelop that for a commercial purpose, you know, a neighborhood commercial service use, it'll need to be a mixed use site that accommodates residential and commercial, for example, because that allowance of density will need to be accommodated in the future, whatever form it takes.
But we've seen with the speculation, for instance, in the Capilano, the larger lots, the larger homes that have been in there, which are basically, some of them are the size of 4 to 6 units of the way that this is proposed. It's hardscape from lot line to lot line. And we're not, I mean, so our development permits, so we could use development permits.
Form and character rules, site coverage in terms of impervious area. Those will be part of the conversation and recommendations in the zone. We already have some rules around total impervious area coverage in rear yards. And so
But we know it's not enough now.
We'll provide advice to council about both what the provincial policies say, but also what we think could be reasonable. But no doubt there will be increased impacts to these sites with this increase in density. No doubt.
I think the community should be very, very worried about what's going on here, very worried, and you should be contacting your MLAs, and you should be phoning the newspaper, and you should be writing petitions. This is a disgrace that the provincial government is putting us in, and yeah, can't wait for that election.
I'd like to hear from what people that came who are on the speaking list or whatever. Yeah.
Do we go to virtual first? Okay.
And if we have time, we can open it up to anybody here who'd like to speak.
Dr. Cost, are you there? There he is.
I think.
Can you hear us?
Now, yes,
I can hear you.
thank you. Well, I'm equally stunned, of course, about what's going on. I did have a presentation, but since you've probably received my presentation already, I thought I would bring out some questions. There are lots of historical pieces of legislation. For example, the 10-year ownership of a principal residence becomes tax exempt, but it cannot be forced to have an increased tax due to you rezoning my property, for example. So there are overrides of provincial due to other legal pieces of legislation that they haven't dealt with at all. Now, if zoning change while I own a property, do the changes automatically apply to my property? That's the question. And how is this going to be addressed? How will municipalities deal with resistance to rezoning by the local residents? Maybe because the local residents say that they don't want this increased traffic or noise. It changes the neighborhood character. You yourself just showed that a slide where the end goal of the public engagement was to empower our community and our citizens. It seems that if we don't want something, despite the fact you say you will implement what we decide, how can you do that when the province says you can't? It sounds like just gibberish writing that has no meaning to any consultation process if we don't have the power to rule our municipality. I would advise also putting on GeoWeb the status of every property that is going to be redesignated so that you can click on your own property and find exactly, rather than try to get it from these maps. GeoWeb is a great tool. Use it for that purposes. This more participatory planning approach will be needed to deal with this resistance that I see coming at the hall and to the province. It's negating the public hearings. How can that be part of the participatory process? It's like the barriers are in place and they're sort of immutable for us to deal with. I feel that the community voice can be quite strong under these circumstances. If push comes to shove, I don't know how our council will propose to address our concerns as a community.
Mr. Cost, your time is
So-
almost up. You just
So
wrap up.
I think I've brought enough indicators here that we better start consultation immediately and really honestly and openly, so we can have our say as just what is coming at us. This is actually unheard of in any jurisdiction I've researched, that I've gone down this path, that there isn't some way in which the community can make some decisions on the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cost. Mr. Gurley? Can you hear us?
Yep. Can you hear me fine?
Loud and clear.
So thank you, Mayor and Council, or Acting Mayor and Council, for the opportunity to address you this evening. As Mr. Cost said, it's certainly an exciting time. And I, for one, think that this housing crisis offers not just a danger, but also an opportunity. I think done right, the policy decisions that the council make over the course of the next couple of months could set a tone for the district that improves some of the impacts of sprawl that we feel today in the district, and with regards to traffic, et cetera, and improve our quality of life. So there's two sides to this this decision-making process, and I think I would like to see us adopt policies and design these new zones so that we don't have lawns full of cars, we don't have a disconnection of houses or homes from the streets, so we don't increase social isolation. I think there's opportunities here to think about where all these people that are going to live in these 4 and 6 person SMUs and the TOAs, where do all those people work? And are we going to enable more mixed use within our residential areas, or is it going to continue to be merely used for sleeping? How can we encourage the development and appearance of third places like cafes and gyms or pubs? If the density of my neighborhood is going to increase over the next 30 years, I should have a pub or a cafe within 10 minutes walk of my house. So I think, another consideration is, it looks like every cul-de-sac is going to have a mansion on, the single home that remains on a large lot, because it's in a designated area for flooding or fire or something. And so the cul-de-sacs, have this mansion at the end, and then it's a bunch of smaller units toward the main street. How are we going to integrate the different types of people that are going to live in all of these places and ensure that everybody is included in the community, not just some people? So I'm excited about the next 2 months. I'm going to give you a lot of my attention, and I'm hopeful that we can improve the district through this process. Thank you.
Thank you. more virtual. To in person.
Sure, there's others as well.
Are you representing the whole group?
No, no. No, I'm not representing anybody. Hi, I have 3 points, but the first one is a question process. So as of June 30th, do you start accepting applications for building one of these on the smooths I'm speaking of in particular? Like as of June 30th, somebody comes forward. The question, and that question relates to another part of that question, which is how the heck are you going to stop speculation? Because I've been involved in SkyTrain since the original SkyTrain, and I watched Edmund Station go from greenfield to what it is now. You can bet somebody made it. That's it. A lot of money off of that. So how are we going to stop that? How are we going to stop somebody buying up a ton of properties and speculating, like holding on to it for a while before it gets developed?
Sure, just to answer the question. So if, once the zoning is in place, there'll be the opportunity for owners to apply
Right away.
to develop right away those properties. There will be a regular permit approval process to go through in order to develop, but the zoning would be in place. That's what the province is mandated for every community where SMO applies. In terms of addressing speculation, I think one of the key considerations that we have to look at is those development cost charges and amenity cost charges. We need to ensure that there are charges in place so that people don't assume that they can freely develop a neighborhood without addressing the infrastructure questions. Infrastructure will need to be developed and improved over time based on the densities that are proposed, and we'll be providing more advice to council on that, but what the potential cost might be. And the reason why that addresses speculation is that then whoever is looking to buy, they may still speculate, but at least there's known costs, and they can then factor that into their decision about whether or not to develop.
Big costs. Okay, so one other thing, or a couple, I'm assuming that when this happens, and you suddenly got six dwelling units on one lot, that all of the normal building bylaw stuff about spatial separation and exposure protection still stands. So there'll be a different kind of construction happening on all these wall-to-wall properties.
That's correct. There's no change to the BC building code. So all the BC building code rules for the essentially a multifamily development going in would apply.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm concerned, we know that fire spreads better if there's more density, and those rules are meant to protect against fire spread, especially as Lisa was saying with and the other thing is, okay, so density versus the number of units. The TOAs have totally different, they have an FSR approach as opposed to the SMOOs. So the SMOOs are number of units. That's addressing the number of units that the province is looking for. The TOAs are not. Those could all be luxury units that are 5,000 square feet. There's nothing in there about that at all. Do you have any power over that?
Whether or not a development is luxury or lower cost.
No, the size, like the FSR, so TOs are not limited in terms of the size of the unit. It's just the FSR. So that means it could be 1 unit per floor.
Yeah.
So the province has published a provincial guidance document for small scale multi-unit housing that has some recommended ranges for various things such as height, setback, site coverage, which leads to an FSR. So we'll be, as we discuss with the public, we'll be seeking feedback on those kind of policy objectives. But we know that a development that is 4 or 6 units from our initial analysis will be bigger, right? Will be bigger volumetrically than a single family. And so the zoning will have to accommodate that. We can't just say, we're going to use the existing zoning and we'll just to accommodate 4 or 6 units in the existing volumetric area of a single family home. That we know that can't be accommodated. And so that's why we're looking closely at the provincial guidance, and we'll come back with bylaws. At this point, we're just being engaged in the community. What folks think works, what they think doesn't in their community in terms of FSR, in terms of height and size.
But the TOAs, the TOAs.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because what essentially the provincial regulation does is it says we have to accommodate a certain amount of FSR and height for residential development. It's a question of whether or not we can also then impose the need, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, for commercial uses, say on the first story, and then residential above. So still achieve the same height and density for the residential component of the development, but require other uses in that site. It's not, the language isn't super clear on what that can be achieved. When we talk to the province, they say, yes, you can plan for mixed use forms and so on, and still accommodate that density and height.
But you can't demand number of units, not a unit was.
No, it's
Market driven.
well, I would say demand number of units as we go through the rezoning process, because we're recommending that there be a rezoning process for each transit-oriented area of property. That will afford us the opportunity to talk about some unit sizes and some of the issues that you're speaking about. And it's just that we're not recommending we pre-zone all those areas. Instead, we think we should have a conversation about the issues that you're raising on a site-by-site basis.
Well, we've lived in Blue Ridge for almost 60 years, and what I'm seeing happening now that you've been thrown is not what I consider democratic. I don't know how we got in this mess, but what comes after this? That's one point. The other is all of the streets in Blue Ridge are different widths. Berkeley's quite wide, Hill Drive is not. When you've got parking both sides, I don't think a fire truck can get up there now, and that will only get worse. And my third point is, we've seen what happened in Paradise, California. We've seen what happened in London. We've seen the traffic in North Van. We've seen, I know of 3 fires last summer, and we were lucky there was no wind. You might recognize some of this because I sent you all an email, but I got not one reply. Where are we going? This isn't a case we've been told of when, it's, or if, it is when. And one lane's blocked on the parkway now, and we have gridlock. Can you imagine everybody trying to feed out of Blue Ridge? Now, the only good thing is that I noticed there are a lot of areas by the trees where you do realize there's an issue. But that east of the Seymour is going to be a nightmare. We don't have an ocean to jump into. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, not so much that aspect, but financially, you know, I don't see how this can develop the kind of solution to a housing problem that we're looking for. By the time you have added your administrative costs to change all this, to add to the infrastructure and so on, there's going to be things there that are going to be absolutely unaffordable to the coming generation. You are going, this has a really good chance of destroying the character of our community completely. And if you think things are unaffordable now, can you know, you referred yourself, where are we going to get this money from? The taxpayer, you know, what's that going to do? The lots are either, you know, the price can only go up. If the price goes up, who's going to afford it? You know, you're either creating an absolute elite core here with a bunch of peons underneath them, or you have something in your hands that is simply not going to work. I really don't see this as a solution to our problems.
You gotta tell the MLAs, because we're being told to do this.
I know.
Your names for the record. Oh, can I have both your names for the record, please? Linda with a Y.
And Walter Selmer, Selmer.
Thank you for your comments. I would like to just reinforce that a lot of these bills have come down without input.
We understand that, but somebody.
Yeah.
You're all in a hard position too, but I understand. I would encourage you, as Councillor Mirren has said, contact your MLA, petitions, anything you can do to create, let your concerns be known and create what you think is wrong and how it should be fixed.
And just on the fire issue, we've just put a new fire chief in place, Mike Danks.
You got a copy of that.
Okay.
Oh, no, Hutchinson, is that?
Okay, so Chief Hutchinson is heart. And Mike Danks, the team leader of North Shore Rescue, is now our new fire chief in the district. And we've spoken to him in the past about evacuation routes and how all of that works. We've done quite a bit of work up in Woodlands for obvious reasons up there. And we know the concerns. The fires that happened last year, the provincial government, they hit them very hard. And that is their course of action on the South Coast in the urban interface, that they would fight it by air. The majority of fighting would come by air, and they did that, and we watched it last night.
Impressive.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive. But we will talk to Chief Danks about an action plan to get out to the community and, reiterate all this information.
What I find interesting is when we first moved up there, one of the issues at council was, how do we deal with the access and egress to that area?
Yeah.
And nothing has changed.
Yeah.
It's like it ever was, except there's more people to take care of.
We'll talk to you about that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name's Jeff Powell. Carolyn over there has exchanged email with me on various occasions. I figured just this time I would finally say hello and introduce myself, because I've been here for a number of meetings. I am the editor of something called the Blue Ridge Bulletin, which is a monthly email that goes out to about 650 people in Blue Ridge. And I'm trying to do my best to summarize those events happening at council that are related to Blue Ridge, and put that out in the email each month. So if anybody is interested in reaching out to me to make effective communications, Councillor Hanson, who is a Blue Ridge resident, publishes in our publication fairly regularly, talking about what council is seeing, what you're dealing with, that sort of thing. That's a sort of a general offer to council members, and to you. I see you back there, because getting this information out feels relevant and important, and that's why I'm here and what I'm doing. So
Thank you.
that's it.
What's the best way for people to contact you?
Email, Carolyn has it, jrpstonecarver@gmail.com.
You can send it to our council at dnv.org, and we'll all get a copy of it. That would be
Okay.
great.
I will do that. I once reached out to Mayor Little and asked if he wanted to put anything in the bulletin, and I never got a reply. So I kind of gave up on that route, but I can do that.
You may get some now.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
That in person you could do is put those upcoming dates.
Unfortunately, the April issue went out on April 1. Had I known these were coming, I will make sure that Carolyn is aware of publication issues, and we'll work together to make sure we can get those out in the future. It's monthly, it goes out on the first of each month.
We have a mailing list of about 400 people. This will go out there.
Yeah. And Blue Ridge does have a Facebook page that's actively
It does.
watched, the Community Association, and then the regular Blue Ridge.
That's correct. The bulletin is part of the community association. So yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Anybody else?
Anyone else?
No. Oh, right. No, you're good. Move adjournment.
No one else here? So we accept the information report tonight, and it's moved to adjourn.
Sure.